Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. Thank you, Kent, for that introduction. And thanks to the Center for Faith and Inquiry for this opportunity to deliver this lecture. It does mean a lot to me, especially because Dr. John Mason was my thesis advisor when I was an undergraduate and a mentor and a big contributor to the reason why I went on to study economics in graduate school. And of course, a big reason why I wanted to come back and teach as a professor at Gordon, which I have the honor of doing now. So as Kent has introduced, my talk today is called Post-Crisis Economics, Thinking on the Average. And I'll start out with, a thought experiment for you. Imagine your neighborhood as a three-dimensional landscape without any buildings, with only hills and ditches, valleys and plains. Imagine that you were picked up and put down in the middle of your neighborhood with a flare in your hand. And your instruction is to find your way to the neighborhood's highest point. When you get to the highest point, you'll wave your flare and a rescue crew will come in and pick you up out of this hypothetical situation. So could you do it? Could you chart a course and find your way to the highest point? How easy it is to find the highest point in your neighborhood depends a bit on where you live. If you live on the island of Tenerife, which is the Spanish island where I had the privilege of spending a semester in 2019 as a Fulbright scholar, it's pretty easy to find the highest point in the landscape. It's that one right there. This is El Teide. This is the highest point on Tenerife. It's the highest point in Spain. It's a volcanic mountain. So in this talk on post-crisis economics, I'm starting with an analogy about hiking, because this is actually a pretty good approximation of how economists think about the decisions in life. For a person described by an economic model, the purpose of life is to find their highest point. And life is an exercise in this optimization, this maximization. It sounds like a nerdy version of Survivor, doesn't it? And in this talk, I want us to think about the choices that we make in this imaginary landscape of our lives. And the goal of getting to the highest point is what economists call preference satisfaction, the measure of value, getting to the highest measure of value in your own judgment. And let me tell you something else about the economic approach, which is that we've done something really clever, which is to take a task as complicated as finding the best point in your landscape of life or the best outcome you could have, something as complicated and we've turned it into something pretty easy, which is climbing a perfectly smooth half dome. So this person has made it to the top. They say, I found it. I guess climbing to the top of a perfectly smooth half dome might actually be kind of tricky if it's slippery, but we'll ignore that. The point of this illustration and what the model is all about is that the way to get to the highest point in the landscape is by always moving up, always taking a step up. Every step that we take is a step on the margin, a step in a small way. And economists call this exercise thinking on the margin, thinking about what small step to take. And the answer to moving upwards, is to think on the margin. If you can take a step up, you're also moving towards the highest point in the neighborhood. But in this talk, I want to point out that there is very likely to be a difference between moving upwards, moving to the highest point, and literally taking a step up in situations that are more realistic than this. A more realistic view of the landscape of life, I would argue, first of all, starts with the observation that life is not so smooth. It's not globally concave. What that means is moving upwards, moving to the highest point in the landscape might actually mean taking a step down. Whether that's true or not, of course, depends on where you start. But someone who starts over on this side, the far right side of the screen, and starts moving up, taking steps up, will only end up at a local optimum. They haven't found the global optimum. They haven't found the highest point, which is the point in the middle on this illustration, because their rule just said, take a step up. It never said, maybe you should take a step down to actually get to the highest point. In life, the marginal steps that we take are many. Things like, do we call our mother today? Do we put more sugar in our coffee? Do we go for a run? Do we hit the snooze button? And if you had a system of living and a rule in your life that said, always go with what's easiest in the moment, always take a step up on the margin, would you be moving necessarily in the direction upwards, the best direction for your life? I think we can all agree the answer is no. So getting to the highs of life doesn't always mean doing what's most enjoyable, but that might be part of the path to get to where we want to go. One of the challenges that we'll talk about is getting the marginal self, the self who would be standing on this local optimum, to think about what else might be out there. Another consideration to make this landscape more realistic is that the highest point might not be obvious from far away. So in economics, our model assumes that there's one well-defined maximum, and either it's known or would obviously be pretty easy to find. And that's not likely to be the case. In part because life is long, in part because life is complicated, and there's uncertainty with every step that we take. The last way that we really need to think about a different worldview for the landscape of life is to rethink the image of the person standing on that mountain alone with the flare in their hand, because we are not alone in the landscape of life. For three reasons. First of all, people like each other. Being on the mountaintop alone is not as good as being there with someone else. There's also an effect that people need each other. Climbing a mountain can be done more easily with teamwork. We'll think about, in this talk, about ways that our decisions affect each other, which are called externalities. A third way that people actually interact with each other in the landscape of life is that people learn from each other. Because people have been around different parts of the landscape of life, they've had different experiences, and they're at different stages of their life. We can learn from each other. We can also learn from history, from people who have gone before us. Learning about what happened in the past is more valuable than economists maybe sometimes realize. So we're not alone. Things aren't always moving up from a given point, and the highest point may not be obvious. So looking for the highest point in a more realistic landscape might look something like this. This is a picture that I took in Tenerife of a beautiful site in Anaga, one of the nature preserve areas of the island. So you can see all of the small images of the people here, and the challenge is it's not anything like the smooth uphill walk. It's more like kind of mountaineering expedition that begins with these people finding a measure of value, finding a way to find the highest point, learning how to communicate, hopefully having some signposts left behind for people who have been on this terrain. And when they get to the highest point, they don't just wave a flare and get whisked away. They have to build a house and try to stay there. So how can we chart a course to this hypothetical highest point? The term that I like to use for this is thinking on the average. What does it mean to chart a course by thinking on the average? It means acknowledging a few things in our analysis and in our planning. So going upwards doesn't always mean going up. This is the idea we've just seen. Going upwards means moving to towards the highest point. Moving up means taking a step. Literally, that's moving up. So the difference between the average and the marginal is that on average, you can be moving up in the sense that you're moving upwards, even if a marginal step is down. Another important caveat is that going down is harder. Going down is harder than going up. Going down is worse than going up is good. So this is an image from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's famous paper from 1979 on prospect theory. And this is a depiction of what is called loss aversion. So what we have here is a hypothetical value function. So we can see a person, a decision maker starting from a reference point. So the reference point is in the middle. And this person is facing a change in circumstances. And the change could either be a good one that they desire, they perceive it to be a gain, or it could be something that they perceive as a loss. And the key feature of this figure is for a given change that's objectively the same size, in the sense that it's the same width, it's the same size gain and the same size loss, the loss will end up putting the person at a lower point, a lower level of value relative to their reference point than the step in the gain direction. It's an equal size step, but it moves them up less high than the going down step brought them down. So it's important to point out loss aversion in itself isn't inconsistent with the standard models of economics. It's consistent with diminishing marginal utility. The idea that when you have less, it's even more beneficial to get a little bit more. The part that Kahneman and Tversky really revolutionized the world with and were part of the founding of behavioral economics is the insertion of the reference point. And this kink here, where at the reference point, where losses and perceived gains are perceived differently. And there's a lot of evidence that in our everyday lives, the status quo is a very powerful reference point, and evaluating gains and losses relative to where we stand, or maybe relative to where we expect it to be, is a way that people really do tend to evaluate things. Another way that thinking on the average changes the way we chart a course is that thinking on the average requires us to recognize the limits of our own perception. What I mean by that is small changes aren't always noticeable. I read an inspirational article about a woman who took up yoga, and she didn't realize that she was getting stronger. These small steps were not even noticeable until one day she was stronger. So small steps can add up to meaningful change. In this context, thinking on the average can mean realizing that the marginal steps don't necessarily have to even be perceptible for them to add up to something bigger. In the you got fit without even realizing it example that works in your favor, we'll also see that sometimes the limits of perception mean that we can take small steps without realizing that we're adding up to something that's actually undesirable. So this can be for good or for bad. We also want to acknowledge again that people are interdependent. So how do we chart a course in the landscape of life? I'll claim that we need to make use of some tools, and I think we have the tools that we need. This is an optimistic worldview and an optimistic approach, I hope. Charting a course to deal with the challenges of life and to hopefully even address the crises of our day, crises like public health challenges and climate change and political discord, begins with an element of faith. So faith or trust is a first step for behavioral change because it requires perhaps the violation of a local marginal, a marginal optimum, a stepping out to look for a possibility into the distance. So we need faith to step beyond our present circumstances into something we can't fully understand. Trusting others, we'll see, will also be an important condition for having social benefits in the landscape of life. Imagination is a tool as well. Imagination is needed to make changes, again, that are beyond our narrow current location in the landscape of life. Researchers have found that helping people save for retirement can be aided by helping them imagine themselves when they're older, and putting themselves in the shoes of their future self. So imagination is useful for charting a course where we don't know where those steps will take us. Empathy is the next tool, which is similar to imagination in that we're imagining something beyond ourselves. Empathy is really about putting ourselves in the shoes of other people. So the other people might be ourselves at different points in time. And empathy might also be the ability to interpret what other people are saying and what other people have found. So in order to learn from other people, to imagine ourselves and our loved ones in alternative situations, it's important to have empathy. My next letter here is L for language. Language is an amazing gift. Language combined with empathy is the way that people get meaningful feedback about, oops, sorry, the light is thinking I'm done. Still here? Okay. Sorry about that. And so with language, we can get feedback about things without having to experience them. So another way that economists sometimes oversimplify is by assuming that people already know what all of the steps in the landscape are like, but we need to communicate with each other to learn about what different paths are like. What is it like to go to graduate school? What is it like to have kids? What is it like to be a pastor? What is it like? So language is the way that we learn. Language is also necessary for people to talk about actions and contingencies. Even if something doesn't exist yet, we can talk about it. So that's the combination of imagination and language working together. So with empathy and imagination and language, we can turn information about what we've experienced at different points in the landscape of life into meaningful data. And then we can become map makers through the process of science. So science is the systematic analysis of the data that we share with each other to lead to meaningful insights. Towards the end of the talk, I'll say a little bit about how I hope social scientists can contribute to thinking about social solutions by both predicting relationships between behaviors and outcomes, kind of thinking on the margin, as well as helping individuals and groups of people think about what kinds of systems would help them move upwards in their own landscapes to achieve the outcomes that are really meaningful for their values. So the acronym it spells out is FIELDS, and we'll talk a little bit about these tools as we talk about what it takes to chart a course. So what does it take to chart a course in the landscape of life? How can we plan a course that moves upwards, but yet takes into account the fact that on the margin, the self is always going to want to go up instead of down. Going down is hard. That's what we saw from the loss aversion discussion. So I'm going to share 5 approaches with you. And there's really only 4 because we'll see the first one doesn't work. So the first approach is deception. The second approach is called map making. The third approach, engineering. The fourth approach, rescaling. And the 5th approach is to jump. So let's dive in. So the first approach, deception. Deception tries to tell the marginal self, the self in the moment, that this isn't really that bad. So we have a person who's trying to get to the highest point, and the sign says, this way is up. This won't hurt. But in fact, the arrow is pointing down, and this way is not up. So we can try to fool ourselves into saying that things aren't hard to do, but that's not really an effective strategy, because in the moment, it will be hard to do the things that we want to do sometimes. And from the social perspective, I think it's even more unwise to think that it's sustainable to try to deceive people into thinking that something is good for them when it actually isn't. So trying to tell a kid that their medicine doesn't taste bad isn't going to help them actually want to take the medicine. It tastes bad. They can taste it. This is not a strategy for success. So what about map making? Now we'll see an approach that has some promise. So map making is the process of charting a course and sharing it with others. This is a kind of trailblazing. Map making puts a signpost down that says, not this way is up, this is going to be good, it's going to feel good, but it says this way is upwards. And for the kid who has to take the medicine that doesn't taste good, it says there's a reason for it, right? There's a point to this. So map making makes use of the tools that we talked about, understanding through language what's going on, and understanding through empathy why we can, and faith, why we can trust other people when they tell us about their experiences, what worked and what didn't. So one example of a person sharing about what worked is the inventor of Couch to 5K. So Couch to 5K is an example of a kind of map to fitness in the landscape of life. And what's interesting is that the person who came up with the Couch to 5K plan is a man named Josh Clark. And he came up with this plan back in 1996. Millions of people have used it. And what is it? So the Couch to 5K plan is a series of steps for what people should do on a given day. People who are total couch potatoes, for them to start walking a given distance, and then jogging a given distance, and then eventually to start running and to be able to run a 5K over a few months. So in reading about Josh Clark's development of this plan, it's interesting because he's very aware of these marginal considerations. He says that no pain, no gain is a hard sell. It's inevitable that you're going to be sore when you start to use those muscles. But whenever possible, he's looking for no pain kinds of solutions. And so how this map making approach works is it's a map that charts the easiest possible course. So when it's not possible to go upwards without going down, we can help each other by sharing the ways that make it as easy as possible, whether that's holding your nose when you have to take bad tasting medicine, or taking the Tylenol after the shot, or following Josh Clark's advice to know how much you have to be able to walk before you can start jogging, or at least jogging with less pain. A map that charts the easiest possible course is a gift to everyone else who's going to be walking that same path in the future. Another approach to charting a course is what I call engineering. So engineering is kind of technological solution. We're thinking about landscapes. We could use a metaphor of a bridge, or maybe terraforming, digging, changing the landscape. And if we know that it's going to be hard to go down, building a bridge or changing the landscape is a way that we can prepare a path that's actually going to work. An example of engineering that I find quite interesting this is a bridge. An example that I find quite interesting is a company called STICKK. So STICKK.com, they call themselves a commitment platform. So founded by two professors from Yale and a business student from Yale, it's a site where people can commit to a goal publicly, say what their goal is. And the goals on this site are organized in communities. So not surprisingly, there's goals about fitness and health and career development, even relationships, spending time on hobbies, the things that people presumably are not doing. They're on the margin, they're not making these choices, but in the sense of moving upwards in their lives, they wish they were making these decisions. So these are the kind of goals that people make on STICKK.com. What's intriguing and brilliant from the creators of STICKK.com is that people put money on the line. So when they make a commitment, they're not required to, but it's recommended that you put money on the line. So if you don't meet that goal, you're going to have to pay money. So you can either pay money to another person or to a charity. It can be a charity that you don't like, so that you really don't want the money to go to them. And you might have heard of this because it's an example of behavioral economics in action. And there's been an impressive impact. So on their website, just as of today, they say there's been over $50 million that have been put on the line, million workouts, over 40 million cigarettes that have not been smoked because of this engineered tool to change people's choices on the margin. So in the context of the landscape of life, thinking about that metaphor, how does this work? And this is why it's brilliant. What STICKK does is it actually makes the alternative to the goal even worse. So imagine in the landscape of life, people don't want to step down. Stepping down is hard. We want to go up. So stepping down is hard. And then the commitment here, it kind of creates a bridge. But what it really is doing is like putting a trench on either side of that low path. So it's the low path that you want yourself to take, and you've made the alternatives even worse, because if you don't stick to that goal, now you have to pay money and at least come clean to maybe an accountability partner. That's another tool that they recommend. So it makes it on the margin an easier decision to stick to your plan, not because it's making the plan more appealing directly. It's not actually raising up that round, but it's just making the alternatives even worse. So this is a really interesting engineering approach. And economists have a hard time explaining why people would want to make these kinds of commitments if they're using that very standard thinking on the margin of just going to the highest point is like always stepping up. If we assume that people are infallible and they can always go in the direction that they want to, and there's no conflict. It's hard to explain why people would want this, but people are voting with their feet, so to speak, and using this tool. Another way that STICKK works is by using the fact that people are sociable and people are not alone in the landscape of life. So another way that this kind of trench is formed is that if people fail in their goals, they don't just lose the money, but they also tell their accountability partners that they didn't do it. So, all right. So another approach is called rescaling. So rescaling is a phenomenon or a tool that is like making yourself bigger relative to the landscape. How is this possible? This is possible if we think about the decisions in life not as a series of little decisions, but as big decisions. It can actually be easier psychologically to make one big decision than to make a lot of small ones. So rescaling in personal decisions can look like this. When you have to go down, fewer steps is actually better. So imagine on the margin, every step down doesn't feel good, but if you make a big decision, it can be easier. So imagine one big step down and then one big step across. What's an example of this? So an example of this from my own life is having a rule about treats at the grocery store. So at Trader Joe's, there are a lot of great treats. And if I were thinking on the margin about every single treat that I passed at the grocery store, it would be hard to say no, right? Every single item you have to be making a yes or no decision. It's easier for me to have a decision to just maybe not buy treats at the grocery store that day. So in some ways it's a harder decision because it's a big decision, but it's just one decision. And that can simplify things a lot. Some people also take this approach when it comes to alcohol consumption. There's a phenomena called dry January, which people in the last few years have been opting into, taking advantage again of the idea that choosing on 31 days to drink a little less than they might otherwise drink is a larger number of marginal decisions that have to go right than just making one decision, one concrete decision to not drink in January. We can put the idea of these individual decisions into the context of social decisions, which is where we want to go if we're thinking about how this thinking on the average approach can help us deal with some of the challenges of society. So when it comes to social decisions and plans for groups and our political lives, thinking on the average means a few things. It means acknowledging, again, the limits of our own perception. So just like sometimes working out could be easy if it's just a bunch of small little steps, but there's also a potential downside that we don't see the cumulative effects of our actions. This is all the more true in the globalized economy that we live in. So everything that we buy has gone through a long supply chain. Every time we are turning up the heat in our house, if other people are turning up the heat, right, that's using more energy. So every small action that we take, it adds up, but we don't necessarily see those cumulative effects. Thinking on the average means trying to preemptively think about those cumulative effects. When it comes to the landscape of society, of course, the issue of interdependence looms large. From a very literal standpoint, we move up and down together because there are values that we share. We want to be on the top of the mountain together. We need to work together to not bring each other down. And finally, social systems should really take account of the fact that individuals inevitably are going to think on the margin. So having a policy or a plan for a group that says everyone's just going to do what's best for the interest of the group, even when it's hard for them personally. Sometimes that works, but it's not a very reliable course to chart. So a few examples that I want to talk about here include rescaling in the context of litter, thinking about engineering to address public goods issues, and thinking a little about how many tools we might need to throw at the problem of climate change. So litter can be thought of as a scaling problem. What do I mean by that? So if one person litters, why would they do that? Well, presumably they think it's easier, right? They don't want to keep the trash in their car, or or in their house, they just want to get rid of it. So it's a small improvement for them. Let's assume it is a small improvement for them. It makes their life a little easier. The downside is everyone littering probably does not result in the kind of world that, well, it doesn't result in the kind of world I would want to live in. And probably it's not the kind of world that the people who litter want to live in either, because it's only the fact that most people don't litter on a regular basis that lead us to have reasonable public works budgets and to not have streams and rivers full of litter. So my little graphic here is a big step down the other side. So sometimes when we think on the average, it means using something like Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative and saying, well, I need to think, what if everybody did what I was doing? Would it work? So that requires the tools that we talked about, imagination and empathy and science too, to really estimate what would be the effect and think about whether it adds up to something we want. One way that this happens in practice is with what's called social norms. So social norms are kind of like a form of engineering, but they're not so deliberate. There's not really an engineer. So a social norm is a shared understanding about actions that are obligatory, permitted, or forbidden. This is Sue Crawford and Eleanor Ostrom's definition. So there are social norms against littering. What use does that play in our metaphor? That says, don't go there. You might think that littering is a little thing and it makes it easier for you, but we ban it. We don't have a rule that says littering is okay sometimes. It's not to be done. It's a kind of, don't go too close to the edge rule. Because if everyone did it, it wouldn't be a good idea. There are, I think, similar questions where a scaling approach would be useful, but they're a little harder than littering because perhaps the benefit to the people who are taking these actions seems bigger. So for example, thinking about social distance protocols during the COVID-19 pandemic, people who would like to not be distanced, perhaps they're young and healthy and they don't see much of a risk to them personally, they're in a sense relying on the assumption that if they did get sick, the hospitals would be available to take them and that there would be a healthcare system in place. And whether or not that's true or not depends on obviously the capacity of the system and how many people are getting sick and things that as individuals we don't really have information on. So we don't have social norms around this because it's new. It's not like littering where there's already fines in place. So I think part of many challenges of the pandemic has been the lack of norms and the lack of shared understanding about why certain actions add up to something either desirable or maybe undesirable from a social point of view. For a less controversial or an example, we could think about plastic bag bans. So is this something where maybe if one person does it, it's okay, but if everybody uses plastic bags, it's really bad for the environment? I think this is one of the ideas that people, and on the North Shore, we've got many towns that have plastic bag bans now. And what these have in common, all three of these examples, I think, is that the scientific models that we could hopefully create would have a role to play to evaluate what happens in this rescaled landscape. As individuals, we just don't have enough information. We don't see the direct effects of our tiny little actions. And we want systems to stay functional. We don't want to have clogged drains full of litter and hospitals that are overflowing. But the steps between what do I need to do to make that not happen and how can we avoid that requires some common understanding, and scientific models are part of that. An even trickier issue, perhaps, is the issue of public goods. So a public good is a good that can be shared among people, and users can't be excluded from using it. So think of Wikipedia for an example here. Wikipedia is a public good. Lots of people share the same articles, and anybody can read them. They're just for free on the internet. Economists focus on the collective action problem of Wikipedia. And by collective action problem, we'll see what that means in a moment. But the question is, will people want to contribute to Wikipedia? People contribute, and some people use Wikipedia without contributing. They don't write articles, they don't pay anything, because it is free, and that's called free riding. So using a public good without contributing to it is called free riding. Going back 60 years or so, economists have had a theory of this that's called the zero contribution thesis, which says rational individuals, people who think on the margin, and egoists in the sense that they don't get intrinsic pleasure from other people being better off, they will free ride. Unless a limited number of conditions are met, in general, people will free ride. People won't contribute to public goods. I don't think it's coincidence that the economics articles on Wikipedia, in my personal opinion, are among the weaker articles. I think math and statistics articles on Wikipedia tend to be a lot better. So how can we counter the fact that public goods are desirable? Wikipedia is just one example. Well-functioning PTA committees and everything from the local to national defense and public institutions. These are all public goods. Sharing public parks. How can we have these things and share them? So a simple illustration of the math of a public goods game looks something like this. So we think about individuals having a resource, starting out with, say, $1, and they're going to decide how much to contribute. What gets contributed increases. So in this example, it increases to $1.50, but then it gets shared equally. So what would happen? Suppose we had two people, Andy and Bob. So this shows the payoff matrix. It says if Andy doesn't contribute, what is his payoff? Andy's decisions are in orange. Well, Andy's payoff depends on what Bob does. So if Bob doesn't contribute, Andy gets $1, and if Bob does contribute, Andy gets $1.75. We can think about it from Andy's perspective here. So if Bob doesn't contribute, he gets $1, and if Bob does contribute, he gets $1.75. So Andy is best off not contributing. Regardless of what Bob does, actually, Andy's better off not contributing. We could approach this from Bob's situation. If Andy's not going to contribute, Bob's best off not contributing. And if Andy is going to contribute, Bob would still be better off not contributing. Why is that? That's the free riding. Free riding makes Bob better off. And in the opposite corner, we see free riding would make Andy better off too. What each one would really like is to not contribute anything, and to have the other one contribute. That's the ticket to having the highest payoff here. So this basic framework really lays out the whole public good situation, at least in economists' theory, because this is a stable outcome, a Nash equilibrium, this solution where neither of them contribute. Neither of them could deviate. Given that the other one's not contributing, how could they be better off? So as we move to the landscape of public goods, I have an illustration here. If both of them jump, they can make it to the mountain, cooperation mountain. But if only one of them jumps, the one who jumps goes into Sucker Valley. So that's the contributor. The one who free rides goes up to Betrayal Ridge. That's a harsh word for somebody not contributing to Wikipedia, but I hope it illustrates the point. So with marginal thinking, it's rational to stay on the hill. Why would you take a jump if you don't know that other people will contribute? How could we chart a course in a landscape like this? The fifth approach I've said is to jump. Does jumping really work? Can people cooperate just by trusting each other that they're going to cooperate? It turns out, yes, at least in some settings. So there's been many lab experiments now in experimental and behavioral economics that set people up on real stakes games. They really get money and they have to decide how much to contribute, and the payoffs have the kind of structure that you saw in that payoff matrix. And Eleanor Ostrom summarizes this literature and says people contribute around 40 to 60% of their endowment to a public good. So the example that we had, it was just contributing or not contributing. If you let it be a fraction, it ends up being around half that people contribute. So what helps? What facilitates this? So it turns out that when people play the game longer, they cooperate more. When people can see each other in the room playing the game, that's something that experimenters manipulate, that helps too. There's more cooperation. And there's more cooperation when there's punishment. So punishment in this sense would be monetary or maybe verbal, nothing legal, it's just a lab experiment. But these are features that help cooperation happen. So it turns out institutions and practice are tools that groups of people can use in the lab, and Eleanor Ostrom writes about experiences in the real world too, where people can collectively work together to defy this zero contribution thesis. So here's where I don't really know if it's a jump or is it a bridge. I drew it with a bridge because it doesn't quite feel like a jump. There's some technology going on here. There's some institutional setup and some practice that has to happen. Maybe it's like cooperation mountains closer and you just kind of take a bunch of little jumps. You practice little jumps. I haven't quite worked out this metaphor yet. Let's turn to our last example and say something about climate change. Climate change has been described as the kind of mother of all public goods problems. The global climate is a global public good. We all benefit from a stable climate, and you don't have to necessarily contribute to solving climate change to benefit from it if it were solved, and you don't pay the consequences if you're making it worse. So the zero contribution thesis would be economist's prediction. And here we are on status quo mountain. Status quo mountain is actually a volcano. So in my metaphor here, it's like we've discovered that the mountain is not really a good place to be. So what can we do? So we look out and we see valleys all around, ecological collapse valley, climate refugee valley. It's not a good view. And I think a feeling that many of us have is, where can we go from here? If what you're doing doesn't work, but there doesn't seem to be anything better, don't look up and see any solution that seems better. It seems like there's no higher point. We have to move down. And this is, I think, perhaps the biggest challenge. Maybe somewhere out there is Hopeful Hill. It's out there, but it doesn't feel as high as the status quo mountain. It feels like the only way things could change is by being worse. And I don't know if that's true, but I'll put my acronym back up. I think that humans are just kind of getting started barely in figuring out how things work. And if we can harness that technology and the science with all of the other elements of these tools, the imagination, the empathy, the language, to try to make sense of and communicate what the different possibilities are like, then we can communicate and think about bridges to build and maybe jumps to make and trenches to build, so we commit ourselves to staying the course. I think every tool that we could come up with would probably be necessary to chart a course, really, from the status quo mountain, which is not a great place to be. So what can social science deliver in this? Briefly, I hope that we can do more than think on the margin to predict actions. This is important because we want to understand how systems work. And to be scientific, that is the most scientific piece, the prediction. It's falsifiable. But if what we really care about is, are the systems working? Are we moving upwards? Are people's lives getting better? Is this mountain gonna last? Thinking on the average, I think, is a better metaphor for what we can aspire to do. And there's some role to be played, I think, in understanding why these different tools work from a scientific perspective. Why is it that people cooperate in some situations? Why is it that people contribute to STICK and seemingly tie their own hands to get themselves to do something? What is it that people value about sharing their triumphs with running a couch to 5K? How can we use that understanding of human nature to actually bridge the gaps? So I'll leave you with a last image of the beautiful island of Tenerife. And now the group of people who had been scattered are up on the highest point with their flares, and they're looking out over the ocean. That's the Atlantic Ocean, and there is another island over there. In the picture, there really is another island, Gran Canaria. And so I'll just leave us with a question, which is, we don't know the answer, but what is over there? And it could be Hopeful Hill, or it could be something even higher. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.